to the front of the net. Puck work to the outside to Eklund. Howe back to Eklund again. Kerr sparring with Stevens in front. Eklund creeps behind. Out in front to Kerr. He scores! Tim Kerr and the Flyers are perfect on 5-on-3s. They are 3 for 3. Get their first power play goal of the night and tie the game.
SportsNetwork.com and Wildfire Radio present the O&B Puckcast, episode number 50, as the Flyers prepare for the NHL entry draft and hopefully a lot more in what could be the biggest offseason in 10 years or so. I'm here with my partner, Chef B. How are you, man?
Very good, very good.
And of course, a little late to the party, but he's here as usual. One of 30 podcasts he's doing in the next 10 days from National Pod, National Puck, Brotherly Pod, Brotherly Puck. It is the exhausted Dan the Flyer fan.
Hello, I'm here.
Yes, you're here. But I tell you, we have a really intriguing guest, the first time appearance.
You mind if I introduce him?
No, go ahead.
He is a prospect guru. He writes for a site that I cannot say the name of without getting physically sick to my stomach, but he is a god amongst men. He is the second greatest Dan on Flyers Twitter. Ladies and gentlemen, Dan Silver's here tonight. How you doing, Dan?
I'm good, man. That was I don't even know what to say after that intro. That was phenomenal. No, I'm a big fan of your guys' show, and I was honored that I was asked to come on. So I'm very excited to represent the Dan Cover Your Ears, the Phillies Flyer crew on the show. I'm very excited about it.
Yeah, there's a rivalry here. It's kind of like Alabama, Auburn almost, but not quite. But it's cool. And Dan, we're really glad to have you because it's the right time of year to have you. I mean, I enjoy the Getting Bullied podcast, and I'm sure that most fans listening here do as well. And we know that you're very well-rounded, but of course your specialty is prospects, Flyer prospects, and draft-eligible players. So we're going to get into that in a minute. Let me just have an announcement to make about the show. We're really proud to announce that we are now, the O&B Puckcast, is on iHeartRadio, which I think is number 2 to iTunes in popularity for podcasts. So yet another place you can find the O&B Puckcast. Along with the multitude of other platforms, including our own YouTube channel. Check out YouTube, O&B Puckcast. Just type that in, will come up. And so many others. So iHeartRadio, that's the big announcement. And Chef, I want to start with you. We're doing our 50th show. And I think since, what was August of 17 when we started? Yeah, and... You know, the big news now is that the Flyers are finally getting off their collective butts and making moves with Chuck Fletcher. He goes out and gets the rights, negotiating rights, to Kevin Hayes from Winnipeg in exchange for a 5th-round pick in this year's draft. And the Flyers already had 10 picks anyway, so they have 9. They'll survive without the 5th-round pick. And they essentially have until June 23rd to negotiate exclusively with Kevin Hayes. What do you think about the fit and the prospects of the Flyers signing him?
I think they got a good chance. They got the goodest chance as anybody right now. I mean, there's a couple rumors that he likes Chicago and that's where he wants to go. But, rumors are rumors at this point. I think, and it's just an opinion of mine, I think they will get it done. I think they offer him somewhere maybe a little higher than what he's looking for less years, maybe 4 or 5 years at $7 million, just to get it wrapped up and under their belt. But yeah, I feel good about their chances of signing him. I think Chuck went about it in a good way. He only gave up a 5th round just for the rights. I mean, like you said, there's still 9 more picks, and I I think all in all, I think they get it done.
Okay. A little bit more background information before we get Dan Silver to weigh in here. Kevin Hayes will apparently be coming to Philadelphia this week, according to Jason Martinez. And if you think about it, the Flyers, in the past, when they've done things like this before, according to Bill Meltzer, Dan Silver, it took 16 days between the acquisition of Streit and Brizgalov until they were signed. And, of course, Tiemann and Hartnell in the past, that was kind of already done. And with Dan Hamhuis, if you recall, they traded his rights within a week because they knew that was a dead letter. So what's your thinking about Kevin Hayes and the Flyers prospects to sign him?
First, let me say that I absolutely love Chuck Fletcher trading for his rights, because whether or not they sign him, it's a clear signal of his intent to rapidly improve this team over the summer. And so even if they don't sign Fletcher or Hayes, that's going to be a sign to some of the other free agents out there that, hey, you know what, this team knows what they want and they're going to go after it. Maybe that's a place I want to come play. Hayes is a very good center, could be a good second line center. The Flyers have 3 holes this summer, right, that they want to fill. They've got second line center, maybe a middle 6 winger, and potentially a top pair defenseman.
Right.
And of all of those categories, second line center is the one where there are the fewest available players. You're looking at, from free agency, Duchesne and Pavelski and Hayes are pretty much the main 3 guys that would be pretty good second line centers. Hayes is not as good a scorer as those guys, but he's more well-rounded, which may actually fit in better with the Flyers, because you got a guy like Jake Voracek who doesn't play a lot of defense. Now you put, a big, strong center like Kevin Hayes who plays both sides of the ice, and it's probably a better fit than Duchesne or Pavelski potentially. I think that, a lot of people were expecting this to happen immediately. They thought maybe, Hayes played for Alain Vigneault in the past. Maybe he wants to come back and play for him. It would get done rapidly. That's, as you alluded to, with the days in between some of these other deals and signings. It doesn't, happen like that. So it sounds like what's going to happen is that Kevin Hayes is going to come into Philadelphia this week. The Flyers are going to wine and dine him, so to speak. And hopefully they're going to be able to convince him that this is the place to play. And if he signs with the Flyers, he's going to be giving up a lot. I mean, these guys play their entire early part of their careers just to become unrestricted free agents and create bidding wars. So he will be giving up a lot of leverage if he doesn't sign. But I think that the Flyers have the available space to like Chef said, give him something like, between $6 and $7 million a year, between a 5 and 6 year contract. And I would hope that that's the kind of thing that would get it done. So I am also fairly optimistic that they will get this done. And I think that would be a huge to get it done before the draft next week, so that that will better allow them to figure out what they're going to do with that pick.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point. And the thing is, to be able to have assets still in hand as you pursue a top 4 defenseman, Dan, the other thing about getting a guy like Hayes, like Dan Silver alluded to, he's a more well-rounded defenseman. So you think of all the strain on Couturier and Giroux on the penalty kill late in games. To have another player who's well-rounded and take some of that slack up, it really would help the team tremendously.
It's been one of the major missing pieces on this team for quite a few years. You got the Giroux and Couturier that can, produce offensively as well as defensively. Then you got guys like Lawton who are good defensively but struggle to produce offensively. So throw somebody like Hayes in here who can do a little bit of both, and it should make this team better immediately. Yeah,
I think so. Dan, I want to go right back to you because you're on the Broad Street Bully podcast, and I want to give those guys a shout out. Check out the Broad Street Bully podcast. And you guys were talking about when the Hayes trade went down. We got to talk about this. Let's get a laugh. Fans in Buffalo, a site that had a lot of followers, were saying, "Oh well, so now Couturier could be coming to Buffalo." Unload, if you will.
That was, shooting for the stars if you're the Sabres, I guess. I don't know what those people were thinking. I think they don't know enough about, Sean Couturier, and I guess to some extent I understand. He probably is one of the, more underrated players in the league, but I don't know what bringing in somebody like Kevin Hayes, who's, just a guy with a little bit of extra potential, for somebody like Couturier, who's, leading the team in points and being very productive. I don't know what they were thinking, but those it really caught on. There was quite a few Sabre sites that went on to promote news like that, but all we did as Flyers fans was sit here and laugh in their faces.
Yeah, and why not, Chef? Because the thing is, the whole point of bringing in Hayes is the fact that Nolan Patrick has not been able to step up just yet. And Hayes has the availability to go to wing if need be, if Patrick became the player we expect him to be. And obviously, it's not to bring in Hayes and then jettison a superior player in Couturier.
No. Look, this team, and we talked about, they're looking to add pieces, not give away pieces. And that whole thing about trading Coots was one of the most ridiculous things I've heard. I mean, like when they signed JVR, you thought, oh, wow, that's great. All the goals he had and all the points, you just signed your leading goal scorer. That's what, a lot of people thought. And I think even I said that on one of our podcasts, and then turn around and it's Coots again. So, no, you're not going to trade arguably one of the most consistent players you've had in the last couple of years. He's up there, if not, he's probably up there with G and being consistently good. So, Buffalo fans just proved that once again, that's why they're Buffalo fans.
Well, they're usually knowledgeable, but maybe their knowledge is limited to the Sabres and how bad they are. And Dan Silver, just finishing off the idea of Kevin Hayes and maybe a backup plan. We're going to get into some rumors that are apart from this coming up a little later. But I have heard from the fourthperiod.com, and we'll get back to them later, like I said, about some other things they said, that if the Flyers do not sign Kevin Hayes, a backup plan may be Toronto's Nazem Kadri. They've had some conversations, and like Dan said, Hayes might be looking to go to Chicago. That's a maybe. We don't know. But what do you think of Nazem Kadri as a backup plan, which, of course, would cost assets?
Yeah, Kadri's an interesting case. I mean, he's a guy who's put up some pretty good offensive numbers. He's been very streaky over the last few seasons. He's also got a mean streak, has been illustrated as he's had a couple big suspensions in the playoffs that have really hurt his team. So we talk about Radko Gudas, and you never know when the guy's going to do something stupid and get suspended. Well, Kadri's kind of like the same way, but he's a very good player. And I think that if the Flyers miss out on Hayes, I could certainly see them going after a guy like Nazem Kadri. You're going to have to be willing to pay the price, though. And, what the Maple Leafs need this offseason is they want to add a top four defenseman. They're going to be losing Jake Gardiner, Nikita Zaitsev, who, is a polarizing player. I've never been a big fan of his, but he wants a trade. So they're going to be looking at, Morgan Rielly and Jake Muzzin are, their main two really good defensemen, and, Travis Dermott will come back, but they desperately need to add defensemen. So if you're going to try and get a Nazem Kadri, you're going to have to give up a Shane Gostisbehere or a Travis Sanheim or a Phil Myers. I mean, there's no way around it. If you're going to get Kadri, you've got to give up one of those guys. And so it's a question of if you're willing to do that, which is why it would be such a positive if they could sign an unrestricted free agent like Kevin Hayes, because you add him without giving up any pieces, and then that frees up some of your other pieces, which I just talked about, that you could use to potentially add a defenseman.
Right, exactly. And it would probably be Gostisbehere because, we said on the show, the Flyers need a different type of defenseman. It's not that we're selling Shane Gostisbehere short, and it's just with the contract and what he can do. He's very attractive to teams that are up against the cap. He's controllable for a couple more years at 4.5 or in that neighborhood. So, yeah, I think it would be. And we'll just have to see how that turns out. But preferably sign Hayes, have those assets to go out and get a Trouba or a Spurgeon. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I'm going to move on, gentlemen. Let's talk about the Stanley Cup Finals. The official prediction from the O&B Puckcast was the Blues in 7. Well, Dan, We are at a Game 7 in Boston, and each game seems to have to tell its own story. It's really hard to say one team has had momentum, and just when you feel that way, it turns out not to be the case. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think obviously the star of the series, one way or the other, is Tuukka Rask, and he's been, Boston's backbone throughout this series and has prevented the Blues from gaining any real momentum there. So I think one way or another, he may be the Conn Smythe, whether they win or lose. I think we talked about this on Coast to Coast this past week about, if it's a potential anymore in this day and age to see the Conn Smythe go to losers. And if Boston loses, maybe Tuukka Rask.
No, I agree. I could definitely see that. Chef, your thoughts about the final so far, and what are you thinking about what's going to happen tomorrow night?
Well, I think I think and I hope it's going to be the Blues. I think it's going to be a very tight fought game. With all the speed and stuff around the league, it's kind of funny how we haven't mentioned it yet. Two more physical teams, let's just say, are in the mix for the Cup. So. How long that stuff lasts, you never know. But it's interesting, and I think Dan's right. I think Tuukka Rask has been the difference in this whole series. He shut him down a couple games, and boy, I mean, it's been great. It's been great to watch. At least, I mean, the Stanley Cup at least didn't disappoint.
Yeah, I'd say it's really been a good series. And Dan Silver, I would depart a little bit from what Chef said. I think. Even though the Bruins are physical, the one advantage they had coming in, besides some high-end talent and maybe a little bit of an edge in goal, but the most noticeable one was the Bruins' team speed, which the Blues have been able to neutralize most of the time, and that could be a big factor going into tomorrow.
Yeah, it's been this really has been one of the most entertaining Stanley Cup Finals that I can ever remember, and the sheer physicality is unbelievable. I mean, there's shifts where I'm thinking to myself, literally every single guy on the ice could have been injured on that shift. You've got guys throwing clean hits. You've got guys throwing dirty hits. I mean, people are skating around like torpedoes and cruise missiles in the offensive zone, just drilling people. It's really been a great series. And, Game 6, the Blues came out very strong. Rask made some big saves. And then, our buddy Braden Shen, who's never had a particularly high hockey IQ, took a dumb penalty. And Ryan O'Reilly shot one into the crowd. And Brad Marchand scored on a Brad Marchand type of 5-on-3 goal. And the Bruins kind of took control of the game after that. In the second and third periods, they just didn't give the Blues any space. It's been one of these series that's been very difficult to predict. I think most people probably thought that the Blues were going to wrap it up on home ice. I still think that the Blues are probably going to find a way to win Game 7. But if you look at it from a purely, talent-based and rational perspective, the Bruins certainly have the edge. I don't know. I just feel like the Blues, and it's silly to say this because both teams want to win the Cup, but I just feel like the Blues maybe want to win it a little bit more than the Bruins, and I could see them pulling it out. But honestly, nothing will surprise me in this Game 7.
Yeah, they're going to win it for Gloria. But yeah, the Blues. It is impossible to predict. There's just something about the Blues that feels like fate, and maybe that was interrupted a little bit when Chara pulled his Willis Reed thing, where Willis Reed, back in 1970, I believe, came out, was injured, and went up against the big bad LA Lakers with Wilt Chamberlain at the time. Of course, somebody my age who's close to 60 would remember. And that was very inspiring for the Knicks. They went on to win that series versus the Lakers, and maybe that interrupted some of the mojo that the Blues had, but I still think obviously we're going to stick with our prediction. The Blues will find a way to get it done. We'll just have to see. So we're looking forward to that tomorrow night. So, gents, we're going to move on now to some trade rumors, starting with one. Dan, I'm going to start with you. Our friend and your contributor on Coast to Coast, Anthony DeMarco, who's based in Montreal, said that, and Dennis Bernstein, his partner at the fourth period, also backed this up, that the Habs had interest in Shane Gostisbehere, hearing that Andrew Shaw and Paul Byron were among the target names in a potential swap. Obviously, that just sounds like a conversation. What was your reaction when you saw that?
I was horrified when I saw that. Trading low, I'm not a businessman, but trading low is always a bad idea. And Gostisbehere is obviously at a low after his atrocious season. So I think getting rid of him now is a bad idea. There's been talk about the fans that wanted him traded for, since the trade deadline. And I just don't think it's a good idea to move him while he's low. At this point, the Flyers have 6 defensemen that can reasonably go out there and play a good game. So I think breaking that up now is a bad idea. I don't like the return from the Canadians. But I would not trade Gostisbehere right now. I would see what happens this season, if he can get some of his mojo back or not. And if not, then they may have to resign the fact that he won't be able to do it, and we'll talk about it then. But for right now, I would keep Shane Gostisbehere.
Okay. Dan Silver, I'm going to go to you. I checked some other sources with this, and I'm not a big fan of the quality of the rumors from Hockey Buzz and Eklund. I think he's a really nice guy. He has a great site. But he does have some Flyer contacts that I tend to trust more than some of the contacts from other teams. And his source decidedly said, no, this is absolutely not happening. And they speculated further that, they could see Shaw being somebody the Flyers like, but maybe for another Flyers player or as part of a bigger deal.
Yeah, I agree with my fellow Dan on this one. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me at all. Andrew Shaw and Paul Byron are, in my eyes, they're both third-line players. I mean, maybe you could argue that potentially second-liners, but I think you're talking about 2 third-line guys who, hover around 15 goals, 40 to 45 points, and Shaw's due $3.9 million for the next 3 seasons, and Byron's due $3.4 million for the next 4 seasons. I mean, you could just do so much better for Shane Gostisbehere than trading him for those 2 guys. So I have a very hard time believing that this is something that Chuck Fletcher would have even entertained, and this is a rumor that I wouldn't put too much stock in.
No, and I agree. And the thing is, the conversation can be had. Could be a one-way conversation, all of a sudden it becomes a rumor. So you always have to be careful about that when you talk about these things. And, Chef, just one final point on this. They went on to say with a Hockey Buzz, they were talking about Cam Talbot, and that the prospects of him coming back are definitely not an automatic. Flyers could be looking around at something. The Flyers also need a backup goaltender. And this kind of brings me to something else I wanted to talk about. I think when you listen to Chuck Fletcher, and we talked about this on the show before, he has said repeatedly how concerned he is about putting a lot on Carter Hart. You might need 3 goalies these days. I don't know how you get 3 goalies with contracts and a salary cap being what it is. I'm not surprised that the Flyers might be looking beyond Cam Talbot or Brian Elliott, who's 34 with groin, abdomen, and hip problems. Maybe the Flyers might trade for somebody's backup who's making a little more money than the other team is comfortable with. Chef, your thoughts?
Yeah, definitely. I think that is a dramatic possibility. And just to touch on the ghosting myself, it's kind of like premature, like Dan said. You're not going to get the value back, and right now the value is in his deal. He's got a pretty reasonable salary right now that you can deal with for the next 2-3 years. So I'm fine with that. So, but the whole thing we talked about before is they need to address the goalies. I mean, Carter Hart, yes, very good, very good. We can see a future with him, but the thing is, like Fletcher said, and I think I'm going to even quote you a little bit here too. You're going to need that guy who is borderline, that can come up from the minors, from the Phantoms, and maybe plug a hole here at 10, 15 games anymore. The days of a goalie tandem, which was one of the things that Ron Hextall said, I agree with. The days of the goalie tandem are gone. You're not going to see that. It's going to be 2-3 guys anymore. that are going to have to share this load. And I think it's not out of the realm for them to go out there and get a better guy and then have a backup guy in the minors.
Let me clarify that. Do you mean that the days of the goalie playing like 60, 65 games are over?
Yeah,
okay.
I think so. I think you're going to see 50 game, 55 game max anymore. I just think that, from before, the players back then were not, I'm not going to say not as good, but the skill level of everybody has grown. So your third line, your fourth line guys might have been your brawling guys and they were bruisers, because that's the way the league was in 30 years ago. But now your fourth line guys are faster, stronger than some of the fourth line guys now would have played on the second line 30 years ago. So they're getting up and down the ice faster, and these goalies are seeing a lot more action than they would have 25, 30 years ago.
Oh, yeah. The demands for all the players, and especially goalies, are higher, and the standards for goalies are definitely higher. Just one thing I want to throw in here. A lot of the ghost discussion points away from the contract were generated again by Elliot Friedman in his 31 thoughts, and just his latest one, or the one before, he had interviewed Rick Wilson, who was the defense coach of defense under the old staff, who just got let go, and he was talking about all the defensemen, and conspicuous by his absence, Dan, was discussion about Shane Gostisbehere. And when asked about him, he said, "I would just say I'm a little disappointed. I couldn't help him bring more of his best on a consistent basis. He is very talented, and it is in there." But this is the second coaching staff that Shane has had a problem with, which kind of takes us back to the rumors that we started with.
Yeah, I mean, Shane Gostisbehere even said as much at the end of season meetings, that he much preferred Dave Haxtell and his staff over Gordon and his staff. So I really don't know what to think of that. Gostisbehere, I don't know. I really don't know what to make of Shane Gostisbehere at this point. He's proven that he can be an elite level offensive defenseman, but he's just not good defensively. And when that offense isn't, flowing like we saw last season, he really just is a guy out there. So his future really depends on, him getting his offensive capabilities back and, really being able to QB that power play and make things happen.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see what happens. I think the overriding theme when we started out was sign Kevin Hayes and maintain your assets so that you can do other things. If we're going to trade Shane Gostisbehere, let's not trade him for two guys that are really F7, F8s. And like I said, I don't put a lot of stock in it, and we'll see what happens going from there. But Dan Silver, I guess about 10 days ago, Kevin Allen was on the air talking about PK Subban being on the move, and his act on and off the ice is wearing thin. And what happens with a guy like him, as much as he's a really good player, he takes up a lot of energy in the room. And now this has happened in two locations, so it's hard to ignore that there's something there with that player, as much as we like him.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a theory on Shane Gostisbehere, which
Sure.
I just want to briefly cover, which is, to me, he's a guy who kind of he rides emotional highs and lows, right? And the years that he was very good, his rookie season, and 2 years after that,
right?
He was the guy. I mean, he was the guy who was scoring big goals. He was top 3 in the team in ice time. Things were kind of going his way. And then the years that he's kind of had down years, it seems like things snowball. To me, he's the kind of guy who, look, if the Flyers are going to go out and they're going to acquire a top pairing defenseman, let's just say, for argument's sake, they get Jacob Trouba, right? Well,
right. Then
your top pair is Ivan Provorov and Jacob Trouba, and then your second pairing's probably something like Radko Gudas and Travis Sanheim. Ghost is going to be getting borderline 4th or 5th defenseman minutes, and I'm honestly, at this point, not sure that he can be the kind of guy that we saw in his rookie season or in his third season if he's getting fourth or fifth defenseman type of minutes. I think he's the kind of guy that's got to be playing a lot. And so I lean towards keeping him just because I think that the shot that he has on the power play is kind of a weapon that only a few defensemen in the NHL possess. And I think that he's the key to the Flyers having a top 5 power play. But I'm not as steadfast against trading him as some people are, just because I do have doubts of just how good he can be if he doesn't perceive himself as the focal point for the defense. So, I have some concerns about him. He hasn't really gotten along with any of these coaching staffs. I mean, he said that Dave Haxtell's group kind of took the reins off him a little bit, but I don't think he got along with Gord Murphy, who was the assistant coach under Dave Haxtell. I am pretty sure that he didn't get along with him.
No, he didn't.
So, there've been issues with the coaches, and I'm just, if they could get a good return for him, I might be on board with it. A guy like PK Subban, the interesting thing with him, obviously he's very talented, but him and Michel Therrien, who is the Flyers' new assistant coach, I mean, Michel Therrien and him did not get along whatsoever, to the point where their feud went public. And so I would, just based on that, I think I'd be surprised if Chuck Fletcher ended up trading for Subban, and he'd have to give up a lot for him. You're probably talking about Shane Gostisbehere plus something else for Subban. So he's very talented, but it's difficult to make a trade involving a guy that's making $9 million a year. It's just from a cap perspective.
No, absolutely. And I would add one thing. I wasn't really going to get into it, but you made a really good point with Shane Gostisbehere. There was a point at which Ron Hextall, when he was still the GM, came down and was screaming at Shane Gostisbehere for basically not listening to Gord Murphy. So they had their trials and tribulations with Shane, and then of course Hextall's out, and you get the new guy in. Wilson seems like the nicest guy in the world, easiest guy to get along with, and yet I think a lot of what you said comes into play. But to me, I kind of put it under the heading of maturity. If you have to earn, to be that right to be the big kahuna, that means you have to round out your game and everything. And because he hasn't, he gets frustrated. So he kind of wants to have his cake and eat it too. And I think he'll outgrow that. It's just a question whether he'll be able to do that here, especially with the coaching staff of Vigneault, Mike Yeo, and Michel Therrien. Good luck. So, yeah, a lot to consider there. Good points there, Dan Silver. So, also, Elliot Friedman again was talking about Kevin Hayes and what the Flyers want to do. And, Chef, there was a discussion, and if I'm paraphrasing Elliot Friedman, he was one of the top sources out there. Nolan Patrick's name has been, quote, out there. Your thoughts?
I think so much, and it's just for the simple fact of seeing what can be to start a conversation. I think that like, okay, well, you ain't got enough to give back on a Nolan Patrick, so what about something else? I think that necessarily speaking, he doesn't want to trade Patrick. But if he can get like a huge blockbuster trade to make this team better, I think he would pull the trigger on it in a heartbeat. I just think that everybody in Philadelphia and this Flyers fan base is waiting for him to make that big move. And I really don't think he's afraid to do it. I think it could be a possibility, but I also think it could be a fishing expedition.
Yeah, well, when Elliot Friedman says it, Dan, you do sit up and take notice. He's kind of past Bob McKenzie as like the number one rumor guy. Yeah, so it's interesting how that works. Oh, Nolan Patrick, I lost my train of thought there. Friedman said that if the Flyers traded somebody like Nolan Patrick, it would be because it was such a great deal, people would understand why they made such a deal. But if you listen to Bob McKenzie, he said that the Flyers are not looking to do anything like that at all. They're just trying to upgrade at 2C, top pairing defenseman, and they're going to be very aggressive, and that Nolan Patrick is counted on to be the third line center. He's not going anywhere. That's kind of, they want to slot Patrick, and it doesn't make sense with what the Flyers are planning to do for them to be out there talking about him. So it was probably a one-way conversation.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me that his name's kind of getting thrown around, and I highly doubt it's going to happen, but he is one of those interesting characters where I think he's probably going to excel in a lesser role on the third line this year, where the offensive pressure won't be so much on his shoulders. But he is one of those guys that, still kind of has a question mark in terms of what his peak is. So maybe not surprised that his name is thrown around, and kind of what Chef said, going fishing. If there's a deal that is, you can't turn down, then you may have to pull the trigger, but I highly doubt that he's going anywhere.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking about. Dan Silver, just wanted to weigh in with you before we got to the prospects and things like that. Any observations about some of these other rumors?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Dan Esch said earlier about you
That's
don't
twice
really,
now. Wow.
Yeah, exactly. You don't really want to trade a guy when his value is kind of low, and Nolan Patrick is. You're looking for him to have a breakout one of these seasons. I mean, he's been good for month stretches at a time, and a couple years ago he was kind of good for the whole second half. He's a guy you'd be selling low, and so I think you want to keep a guy like that, sign a second line center, or trade for a second line center, and give Nolan Patrick a chance to really blossom. I mean, I take all these rumors at this time of year with a grain of salt, and I listened to Elliot Friedman's podcast, and I didn't come away with it thinking that the Flyers were kind of actively shopping Nolan Patrick.
No.
I would be very surprised if they trade him, and as Friedman said, if they trade him, you will know why. You'll see the deal, and it'll be like, oh, that's why they moved him.
Right.
But I don't see it happening.
No. Listen, the Flyers are concerned that he seems to shy away from contract. Some of that could be a product, or a byproduct, I should say, of some of the injuries he's had and the concussions. But hopefully, we've seen enough players come through here, like Justin Williams and, Patrick Sharp, that were moved out before they had a chance to blossom for different reasons, of course. Not to rehash that, but let's try and put a team together with the pieces that we need. Without jettisoning young players too soon, without a real purpose other than we're not patient enough. But with that, gentlemen, Dan Silver, we got to talk about the Flyers, who have the 11th overall pick in this coming draft. And they have a pick in every round except the 5th, which they traded away. They also have an extra 3rd, a 6th, and a 7th. And first off, do you think the Flyers are going to make this pick? Or do you think they might need it to trade to get one of the assets we mentioned before?
So I think some of it will depend on if they sign Kevin Hayes. If they sign Hayes, I think it's more likely that they could keep the pick, with the caveat that if a guy like Jared Spurgeon or Jacob Trouba, either of those two guys could step in as a top pairing defenseman on this team. If either of those two guys are available and the pick would be included, I think that they would probably move the pick. That being said, we can't lose sight of the fact that you're going to get a very good player at number 11, and this is Chuck Fletcher and Bill Flair's chance this is their first ever first round pick with this organization, and I don't think that's to be taken lightly. Like I almost think that they might rather trade a prospect like a Morgan Frost as opposed to giving away this pick, just because keeping the pick is their chance to put their stamp on the organization, unless there's a guy like a Trouba or a Spurgeon that you could get back. So that's kind of like my take on whether or not they trade the pick.
Yeah, now I could see that. I mean, after all, the top 3 picks in the Flyers organization are Morgan Frost, Joel Farabee, and Isaac Ratcliffe. I think we're all in agreement with that. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, but other than that, some of these other guys like Rupsov and the rights to Allison or Lazinski or maybe even Igor Zamula, Linus Hogberg, and some of the goalies, they were not draft picks of Chuck Fletcher. So I think Dan Silver there has a good point. But Dan, getting back to you with Mr. Dan Silver for clarification, it's the Dan versus Dan. I got to keep that in mind. Who are some of the prospects that if the Flyers stay at number 11 that A, you think will be there, and B, would interest the Flyers? I don't know, maybe 3 to 5 names.
So this draft is interesting in the sense that there's 2 clear-cut top players in Jack Hughes and Capo Kakko. Those guys are definitely going 1 and 2. And then I think there's also at 3 and 4, I think you've got a really good defenseman in Byron Bowman, or Bowen Byram, who's going to
Bowen Byram, right?
Who's going to go 3rd or 4th, and then Alex Turcotte has kind of really crept up the charts, and he's probably going to go 3rd or 4th. After that, I'm telling you, between picks 5 and 13 or 5 and 14, it's very unpredictable how this thing's going to go. And so I'm just going to give you a few names of guys that could slide and would be my top choices, and then a couple of the Flyers guys. So a guy who I think most Flyers fans are going to want them to take is, if he's available, and I agree with that, is the diminutive winger Cole Caulfield.
Oh, yeah.
Some people have him going as high as 5th. Some people have him going as low as 17th. He's 5'7", 160 pounds, and that's always kind of been one of those things that divides people. With the success that you see guys like Alex DeBrincat having, who slid because of how small he was, I think it's more likely that he does go in the top 10.
Right.
But the guy scored 72 goals this season, and he is far and away the best finisher in the draft. He's got an incredible shot. I'm normally not a huge fan of guys like this. Oliver Wahlstrom was a guy like this last year who I wasn't a big fan of because I saw Joel Farabee setting up most of his goals. But Cole Caulfield actually has very good hockey sense, and he's got good stick handling skills. So he packages together that shot with some other good skills. And he's a guy that if he was available at 11, I think the Flyers would be hard-pressed not to take him. I think he's a guy that you have to pick if he's available at 11. There's 3 really good kind of prototypical big centers in this year's draft. And those guys are Dylan Cousins, Kirby Dach, and Peyton Krebs. I kind of view those 3 guys in the same. They're very similar players. Dylan Cousins is a guy I compare him to Jeff Carter. He's a very fast 2-way center who maybe doesn't have the best stick skills, but you could easily see him slotting in eventually as a second-line center. Kirby Dach is a very good in front of the net, very good passer, good finisher. I think he's probably going to go before the Flyers have their pick. Peyton Krebs is a guy who was ranked higher earlier in the season. He kind of struggled a little bit on a team that didn't have much offense, and he just blew out his Achilles.
Right.
So he's a guy that's going to slip, and I wasn't a huge fan of his to begin with, and I don't think I'd like to see the Flyers take him. But if Cousins or Dach last there, I would take him. I'm going to talk about 2 more guys.
Could I just
one is a guy who a lot of people have the Flyers taking, and he actually reminds me a little bit of Joel Farabee. He's a U.S. Forward named Matthew Boldy.
Yes.
He's got good size. He was overshadowed a little bit in the regular season. He's on the U.S. national development team. He was overshadowed by guys like Jack Hughes and Trevor Zegras, who I didn't mention, but he's definitely going to go before the Flyers have a pick. But Matthew Boldy centered Cole Caulfield in some of the postseason tournaments, and they were absolutely incredible. And the hockey sense and the passing and the finishing that Boldy showed for a 6'2", 190 player was really impressive. And if he's available with the Flyers pick and guys like Caulfield and Cousins aren't available, I think Boldy's a guy that you might see the Flyers take. He kind of fits in with the profile of what Fletcher and Flair have taken in the past. So, I'd be looking at him. And then if they're going to take a defenseman, I think the guy that's going to be available that interests me the most is might become the first German-born player ever to go in the first round, and is Moritz Seider.
Yes.
He's a very big right-handed defenseman. He's been getting a lot of hype recently. He plays a very solid two-way game. He reminds me a little bit of a Phil Myers type player. He's got a huge frame, and if they go defenseman, I think Seider would be the guy that they would go with. So, those are the guys that I think the top three would be Caulfield, Boldy, and Seider would be the three guys that I'd be looking at.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting that you said those guys, because I kind of feel very similar, because Caulfield has a skill set that's really in demand right now, the pure sniper, and the whole league felt a little bit, I guess, had caught with their pants down with Alex DeBrincat taken in the second round, and the Flyers taking Pascal Laberge and regretting it. And it's a shame for Pascal Laberge, who got hurt a lot. But Caulfield is, if I recall correctly, Dan, is actually a better skater at this point and has a more well-rounded game at this particular stage of his career than DeBrincat even did.
Oh, for sure.
So, and what's really interesting, in The Athletic today, Craig Custance had an article where they talked with the under-18 coach. His name was Robluski, about comparables. And one caught my eye when you talked about Matthew Boldy. He said if he had to pick a comparable, and of course this is trying to distill things so fans could understand what kind of game he has, he picked Marian Hossa. Big physical guy, plays an all-around game. And of course, if Matthew Boldy could ever skate as well as Marian Hossa, who's on his way to being in the Hall of Fame, well, that would be something. But yeah, I agree with the Farabee comparison. Good all-around game. I think Farabee was a little bit better skater than Boldy, but there are aspects of his skating that are really good, his edges and things like that. So it's not like he's going to be a Matthew Strome or anything by any stretch.
No, he was. I was really impressed with Boldy's all-around game, including his skating at the U18 tournament after their regular season concluded. I mean, him and Cole Caulfield were unbelievable, and Caulfield got a lot of pub during that tournament because he was scoring like 2 goals a game. But you watch those games, and Matthew Boldy was doing a lot of the dirty work and setting him up. So I would be thrilled if they ended up with Boldy.
Yeah, he sounds like a really good pick. And, it's always exciting on draft day to see these guys. Of course, the Flyers are in a different mode right now, and they're trying to win right at this time. They're trying to accelerate their timeline. But let's go to Dan Ash. Dan, a Flyer fan. What impressions have you taken away from some of the draft talk that Dan Silver just laid down and some of the things that you have read?
Well, he knows more about this stuff than I do. I would much rather talk about Samuel Morin, which, was the greatest 11th overall pick in the history of the NHL. So nobody's going to beat him no matter who they select. So it doesn't really matter.
All right.
Hey,
So
there's one thing.
Yeah, I was going to say Dan versus Dan just took a decided turn in favor of Dan Silver there. But Chef, you comment.
I just want to comment on one thing real quick. I want to shout out to, USHL. I mean, how many guys have they got in the top 20 again? Like, depending on whose list you look at. I mean, you referred us to a list, and there's 7 out of the top 15 guys are from United States Hockey League. So, that is just awesome. I think they've really done a really good job there. So, but I kind of agree with Dan Silver. I think that, if you're going to get somebody, if Cole Caulfield's there, obviously you take him. I was on the lines of Boldy if he was there, but more likely that's the more likely one they're going to be there. But yeah, it's funny how many USHL guys are really in the top of the crop now.
Yeah, absolutely.
It really is. It's incredible. And just a personal anecdote, I did I was a minor league hockey announcer back in the mid 2000s for a team in St. Louis, the Missouri River Otters, and the head coach at the time was Jeff Brown, and we used to have mites on ice, in the intermissions. We had a mites on ice game where Jeff Brown's kid was in the game. He was like 10 years old, and two other of the kids in the mites on ice game were both also, Jeff Brown's kid was taken in the first round, and both of these other players were taken in the first round, all coming out of St. Louis. I think one of them might have been like Clayton Keller. I mean, it was incredible. And I was looking back at that, and the U.S. has done an unbelievable job of developing talent. You're talking about Minnesota, St. Louis, even the East Coast. It's been really incredible what they've done the last 5-10 years.
There's no
Dan,
question.
can I ask Dan Silver a question?
Absolutely.
Cool. I was just wondering, do you think, what I noticed was there was a lot, like Shel Samuelson's son was in that league. There was a lot of former NHLers that like kind of relocated to the United States, settled down, had families, and instilled that hockey drive in their kids. And a lot of them are second generation or even third generation NHLers now. Do you think that made a huge difference, an immediate impact?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, because there's a lot of really good Canadian hockey players who made their homes, in the United States, and have now their offspring are kind of like buoying this system. So yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely something that you could look at. There's some Canadian bloodlines going back a little bit further, but they're guys that are settling in the United States. I think that's a good point.
Yeah. Not only that, I think a lot of this really picked up from 1980. I think that was a red letter day for the United States and United States hockey in general. And I think a lot of that momentum really, I mean, they won in 60. Nobody knows that. But when they beat the Soviets, that was a big deal. And it's ramped up ever since then. There's no question. Dan Silver, let me ask you about a couple other players. Did you hear the story about Kirby Dach, and at the combine saying something like he wasn't sure how much he loved playing the game or something like that?
I did not hear that story about Kirby Dach. I will say that I think he's the best of those three centers I mentioned. I think there's been a lot of steam about him going number 5 overall to the LA Kings.
Yeah.
So I don't think he's going to last to the Flyers. I'm going to have to go look up that story. I didn't see it, but I'm a huge fan of the way that guy plays hockey.
Well, he might have the best hockey IQ in the whole draft. I mean, so he's 6'4", already 200 pounds and plus. So, yeah, I think LA is going to get their Gabe Vilardi replacement. Unfortunately, the story of Gabe Vilardi is not a happy one with spine problems. But
it was funny that year that Gabe Vilardi, I thought he was clear cut the third best player in that draft.
Yeah.
And he kept sliding, and I said to myself, there's something must be going on here. And he ended up going like number 10 or number 11 of the Kings, and then it came out that he had this back injury. He's a very, very good hockey player, and it's just a shame that his career's kind of been derailed by back injuries. I'm hoping that he can get it back on track, because he's very talented.
Yeah, that's really a shame. I just want to add something in about Peyton Krebs. Good news for him is that it was a partial tear of his Achilles, and it does matter. He didn't sever it. And inside word, I think midway through the year, or maybe a little bit later, from Anthony Sanfilippo, was that Peyton Krebs had really caught the eye of the Flyers at that point. So I don't know if that means he's off their board or what have you, but just thought I'd throw that in there. And I was looking through here. I'd also heard that another of the best pure scorers here, Arthur Kaliev, who had just an insane amount of goals. Wait, I'm looking that up right now. The knock on him is that he's got the Pavel Brendel gene. He doesn't really do much but score, and he doesn't seem to be interested in doing much else. But one scout said, I think it was Mark Edwards from hockeyprospect.com, I think I have the name right, who was saying, the scout was saying about Arthur Kaliev is you think he doesn't do anything, and then you notice on a night like that, he still had 2 assists. What's your thought about him, and what have you heard?
Yeah, he scored 51 goals this season.
Yeah. Okay.
And,
yeah, just got that.
Which I think is one of the it's one of the high watermarks for a draft eligible player in the OHL. I mean, that's a ton of goals. I tend to think that sometimes what you just said, I've heard that too, that, you won't notice him, and then during the game, and then you look at the score sheet, he's got 2 goals. I'm not sure that's a good thing when you're talking about juniors, because the level of play is kind of so diluted and watered down that, if you're kind of scoring the goals that no one is you're scoring goals, but you're not really doing anything the rest of the night. I'm not I don't know how well that's going to translate. I mean, look, he's only 17 years old, so
yeah,
there's obviously a lot that can change from a maturity level, but I don't think he's in that group that the Flyers would target. I think there's too many very good all-around hockey players for them to target a guy like that early. Because we talked about Cole Caulfield, who scored 71 goals this season, and he does a lot more than just score goals. You mentioned he's a good skater, he's a good stick handler. Yeah. I haven't watched enough of Kaliev, but I don't think he's in that group with some of the other guys that we talked about.
Yeah, and I'd say his shot is an absolute rocket, but his problem is his pace and compete level. So he's got good size at 6'2", 190 for a kid who's 17 or 18 years old. That's he's going to be 18 in 2 weeks. So yeah, so he could be an off the radar guy, because you know what, Jeff Skinner just got paid $9 million by the Buffalo Sabres. And those pure goal scorers are hard to find. Just saying, if the Flyers went off the board a little bit and took a guy like Kaliev, that tells you a lot about the kind of skill set they're looking for. But to wrap this up, I did want to talk about Moritz Seider. And this is a guy who's 6'4", he's over 200 pounds. And a lot like Sanheim in his draft year, Dan Silver, he's a riser. It's like 3 months ago, you looked at him maybe as a second-round guy, and he just came up in the estimation of the scouts, and he interviewed really well at the Combine, made a great impression. He has all the physical tools. The only question about him is how much offense he'll bring, but he should be an all-around defenseman.
Yeah, you're 6'4", 200-pound Russian or German defenseman. We talked about how he could become the first German-born player to be drafted in the first round. He really gained momentum because the under 20 B pool. So we're talking, he's a 17-year-old, and we're talking about an under 20 tournament. The B pool, not the A pool, but he was named the best defenseman in the tournament as what they refer to as a double underage player. You watch him play, he's a phenomenal skater. He'll join the rush, and then he can get back and break up plays defensively. He doesn't have the puck skills that a guy like a Travis Sanheim or a Shane Gostisbehere has, which is, I sort of compared him a little bit more to Phil Myers. And when watching some film of Seider, I was he reminded me a little bit of Phil Myers, because they're both very good skaters. They're both 6'4", 6'5", and he's very good both sides of the ice. And one of the things that I always said about Phil Myers, and I actually had him rated higher than Travis Sanheim at one point as a prospect, was how instinctual he did everything. Myers just always seemed to be kind of making the right play in the right spot, and he looked instinctual. And that's what I've heard people say about Moritz Seider. And so, he's the kind of guy that I wouldn't mind the Flyers taking a shot at, because when you look at the Flyers prospect pool, they've got the 3 very good forwards, Farabee, Frost, and Ratcliffe, and that's how I would rank them in that order.
Right.
But if you look at the defensemen, and there's, Sanheim's up now, Phil Myers is up now, Sam Morin is up now.
Zamula.
Yep.
Hogberg.
Yeah, they've got Zamula, they've got Hogberg, and
Bernhardt,
and Wyatt Kalynuk, but there aren't really
right.
There aren't really any A-level defense prospects that aren't in the AHL or the NHL. And so that's where I could see them replenish the defenseman pool and take a guy like a Seider, or they might like Victor Soderstrom,
right,
who's a Swedish defenseman he's got more puck skills than Seider. He's not as big as him. But I wouldn't be surprised if they took a guy like that. One of the guys who's also been very divisive among scouts is Philip Broberg.
Yeah.
Who's the Swedish defenseman. He's the fastest skater in the draft. I mean, maybe Jack Hughes is a faster skater, but Broberg is a very fast skater. His puck skills leave a little bit to be desired. And if he lasts where the Flyers are, I don't know, maybe they take a shot with him. But I won't be surprised if they take a defenseman.
Yeah, Broberg, he's rated number 9 overall by Corey Friedman. But as we've mentioned, that could be anywhere from something like 7 or 8 to like 32 with the draft, with 8 or 10 different lists that we look at. But and rated 21, by the way, by the Hockey News. So it's Broberg has tremendous skating skills. I can see the way Friedman has rated him, but hockey sense and puck skills are not the best. So. Yeah, we could go on and on about this. One last question about Moritz Seider. Would you say he's a more refined version of like a K'Andre Miller?
I could see that comparison a little bit. I think Miller has more pure talent and skill than Seider does, but that's I could see that as a comparison.
Yeah, that was one of the guys that the Flyers passed up on that when they took Jay O'Brien, and the other obvious guy they passed on was apparently who's really had a good year was Rasmus Kupari, and we'll have to wait and see what's going on with Jay O'Brien. We didn't mention him tonight. For a guy who's drafted that high, that's really disappointing.
Well, Jay O'Brien he's taken a lot of kind of like hate, I would say, on Flyers Twitter recently.
Yeah.
He was injured for most of the season at Providence, and he's now dropping into a lower league, the BCHL,
right.
For next season. Here's my take on Jay O'Brien. I mean, I saw him at Flyers development camp. I thought he was very good. He's a different player than Joel Farabee. He's not as skilled, but he's got a higher engine. He kind of reminded me of Jeremy Roenick, the way that he plays. And then at the last summer in the World Junior Championship Summer Showcase, he was one of the best players for Team USA. He was better.
Yeah.
He was better than Farabee. He was exerting his will when he was out there, skating up and down the wing, scoring nice goals, dishing out some good hits. And I was very, very impressed with him, to the point where I almost had him higher than Farabee on my prospects list. Then the season started. He took a brutal hit to the head, ended up getting a concussion, came back, got another hit to the head, and was out for a while. Then he came back, and he just wasn't the same player. I wouldn't give up on him. I think that there's still a chance that Jay O'Brien could become a pretty good player. A lot of people are kind of saying that this was a terrible pick and they shouldn't have taken him. I liked Rasmus Kupari more than Joel Farabee, so I would have been fine with, and I liked them both a lot. They were my top 2 guys I wanted the Flyers to take with the first of the 2 picks. When Kupari was available when they took O'Brien, I would have been really happy with him, and I also would have been really happy with K'Andre Miller. Those were the 2 guys that I wanted them to take in that spot. But I wasn't upset after seeing O'Brien play. So we'll give him a little bit of a chance. But yeah, Kupari or Miller would have been my preferences.
Yeah, no question. Well, boy, I tell you, we really covered that a lot. I was going to go a little bit more on the Flyer prospects, but I think in our conversation about who the Flyers have on D and the forwards, I think we covered that pretty well. And gents, there's one other thing before we go. The restricted free agents and unrestricted free agent period is going to come up after the draft. I mentioned earlier that starting the 23rd, which is 2 days after the draft, teams will have that kind of legal tampering period. What's that, about 5 days? Well, actually 7 days. And then, of course, you'll have July 1st, the unrestricted free agents and things like that. And July 1st, anything can happen. You can have offer sheets, and the Flyers will be bidding on somebody, maybe. But I really think that what's going to happen before we come back to talk to you again is the Flyers are going to make a trade. And it just, like we mentioned earlier, Dan, Ash, let me get your opinion. If the Flyers are able to sign Hayes, they're going into the draft. Do you think they're going to make a major trade to get a defenseman?
Maybe. Yeah, it's definitely a possibility. And I think if they get Hayes under contract, it really frees up, the rest of the possibilities to do something else, whether that be another scoring forward or a defenseman, to really make some moves. And hopefully, and I think that's a big reason why they need to get, Hayes signed versus anybody else is just, you get that body there, you get the comfort of knowing that that second line center role is filled, and thus they can address other issues like bringing in a top defenseman. Yeah,
absolutely. And Chef, I think that's the anticipation for the number 11 pick. We covered it very well, thanks to Dan Silver tonight. But I think a trade is also something that the fans are going to be looking forward to, irrespective of whether they take number 11 or not, because it is the most biggest flurry of trade activity comes over draft weekend traditionally.
Yeah. I mean, and it's going to be the quickest and fastest way to really dramatically improve your team. In my personal opinion, I don't like this. If Hayes isn't signed, then they make a trade. If he is signed, then they take the pick. I think that's just a logical way to go. I think it dates back to what you said too. Like, hey, this is our first draft. If we can make a huge impact, we will. And that means if Hayes isn't signed before that, and then we're going to go with taking that 11 pick, trading for somebody like Trouba or Spurgeon or whatever, and we're going to make a huge impact. And then maybe they get Hayes too to sign, and they get a little bit of best of both worlds.
Yeah, we'll have to see how that works out. Dan Silver, before we go, weigh in on that. And the next panel question, will AMAC be finally bought out?
So let me, okay, I'll start with the draft. Yeah, I mean, I still think it's 50-50 whether or not they trade the pick or not. I think, as Chef said, a lot of it has to do with whether or not Kevin Hayes is signed. But I do think that if there's an offer on the table where they can get Spurgeon or Trouba and that 11 pick is involved and maybe they don't have to give up too much more, I think that they pull the trigger on that trade. Because Chuck Fletcher wants to win, and he wants to win now. And whoever they get at number 11 is not going to help them for a few seasons. So if there's a good trade on the table, I think he's going to take it. And I think that he should take it because it is a win now mentality that this team needs to have. Andrew McDonald, I think that they are going to buy him out. I've seen a lot of differing opinions on this on Twitter. I mean, the Flyers, if they don't buy him out, they're going to have about $35 million in cap space. If they do buy him out, they'll have about $38.5 million. That's a big difference because they're going to have to dedicate about $20 million to signing Ivan Provorov, Travis Sanheim, Travis Konechny, Scott Lawton,
right,
Ryan Hartman, and a backup goalie. That's going to cost $20 million. So now you're down to, $12 million if you don't buy out AMAC, or I guess a little more than that. Yeah. And you want to sign a Hayes for maybe $6 to $7 million and bring in a top pairing defenseman. I think they're going to have to buy out AMAC if they want to accomplish those things. And that means that your salary cap for not this year but next year for 2020 2021 is going to be inflated by about $1.6 million. But I think it's a trade-off for getting that extra space this season.
Yeah, it's just 1.6 for the next 2 years if they go the buyout route, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think it makes sense to buy him out.
Yeah, I agree with that. Danish, what about you, man?
I would like him to buy it out, but I don't have the trust in this organization to do it. I think he's the cockroach. He's going to last throughout this year. Or he'll probably be buried with the Phantoms, but I do not believe they're going to buy him out.
Okay, that only gives them about what, $9.75 in cap relief. I don't know.
Yeah, I believe so.
I don't know if that's good enough. Chef, AMAC bought out.
No, I think they're just going to bury him in the minors because I don't know if we can trust them to do the right thing. I think that's low on their list, and if they can get other stuff done ahead of that, then they will.
Let me real quick, because both Dan Esch and Chef said that they don't know if we can trust them to do the right thing. I mean, where's that coming from? Because
I know.
Anything that Chuck Fletcher already traded away a 5th-round pick to get the rights to negotiate with Kevin Hayes. Like, if we're talking about Ron Hextall, maybe, and Dave Haxtell, but what this group has done makes you think that they wouldn't pull the trigger and do the right thing on buying out AMAC?
But Dan, you know what it is? They're so browbeaten as Flyer fans. This is what Hextallism is. It does to you. It just destroys your spirit.
25 years of the Flyers stomping on my soul every night kind of drags you down a little bit.
All right, so you need a little.
Think Isaiah feels he's even older.
Yeah, man, I'm more optimistic
I'm
than
the
you.
youngest one here.
Yeah, I'm going to be 60 this year. I've been following this team for 50 years. I'm more optimistic than these guys. All right, with that, Silver, you got to get rolling. I want to thank you so much for coming on the O&B Puckcast. Why don't you tell people where they can find you on Twitter and the Getting Bullied podcast, and, of course, Dan Esch's favorite site, PhillyIsFlyer.com.
Yeah, so first of all, thanks a lot, you guys, for having me on. It's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed listening to your show, and now it's great to have been on the show. It's an honor. On Twitter, folks can find me at dsilver88, and the 88 is for Eric Lindros, who was my favorite Flyer when I was growing up. Then you can listen to me and my co-host, Mark Giannone, at our podcast at Getting Bullied. And then, as you mentioned, I've got the site at Philly is Flyer, which folks can follow. And let me real quickly just say, because you guys are talking about a cage match between me and Dan Esch. And,
yes.
A lot of that is born out of, I think, what the conception of me with Philly is Flyer. But Dan and I really never, we had arguments, but never really anything that was kind of like got personal or anything like that. And let me just say from a personal perspective that he was one of the most important contributors that site ever had, because he's pumping out content almost every day, and really good content. And if you look at what the most read articles on that site were, a lot of them were articles that he read. And so I'm not going to get into the politics of things, but he did a phenomenal job writing content for that website. And I always had a tremendous amount of respect for the work that he put in doing that. So I've never really had any problems with Dan. I think I'd consider him a friend on Twitter at this point. So
absolutely. And let me just say something else. Dan was the spine of that site for a long time. I think it's still a good site, but I think Dan was painted with a brush that was a misunderstanding. I'll put it that way. I'll be charitable. And Dan is such an asset to our show. And I don't want any hard feelings between anybody. And I'm so glad that you were able to come on and we're talking hockey, because that's what it's all about. That's what the Flyers fans love. And thanks again for coming on.
Yep. Thank you, guys.
All right, man. You take care.
You too.
All right. So, Dan, you are associated with myriad sites and podcasts. Why don't you give us a rundown so the fans can keep up with you and your fine work?
They can try to keep up with me. Brotherly Puck at Brotherly Puck, Brotherly Pod, Brotherly_pod at Brotherly_pod. You got National Puck at National Puck, and National Podcast Network at National Pod Net. I will be back on Thursday with the Angry Negative Show, Sunday with Coast to Coast, and then 6 straight days of shows from the 21st to the 26th at the end of this month.
Wow. Now, tell us just a little bit about Coast to Coast. It's a new show with Julia Kender and our buddy, frequent contributor, Anthony DeMarco from thefourthperiod.com.
Yeah, that's right. We have decided to do more of a national approach. You know, we are a Flyers podcast and we're all Flyers fans, but we wanted to do a show kind of looking at the overall stretch around the league and the hottest news around the league. So I picked Anthony DeMarco and Julia Kender, who is writing for nationalpuck.com, to help me out, and that airs every Sunday.
Fantastic. And Chef, you're at Steam Pub in Southampton, PA. Why don't you tell people what they would want to know from you?
Well, you can reach me at Chef to Left B on Twitter, and right now I need somebody that works as hard as Dan Esch. I want the culinary version of him so I can hire him and ride his coattails. That's what I want.
Yeah.
How to be young again.
Yeah, definitely. I'm Isaiah, of course. We're the O&B Puckcast. On Twitter, we're at O&B Puck, at O&B Puck. We are on so many formats, including our newest one, iHeartRadio, iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, TuneIn Radio, Spotify. We were on just recently. We added them. The O&B Puckcast, YouTube channel, Google Play, and of course we're on the sites at Wildfire Radio and also at PhillySportsNetwork.com. Great content there as well. So listen, next show is on the 25th of June after the draft. We're going to be with Russ Cohen, who will be out in Vancouver. He'll give us a palpable sense of what it was like as the Flyers either made a trade, made a draft pick, or did both. So we look forward to that. Russ Cohen from @Sportsology, and it'll be great to have Russ to wrap up what went on in Vancouver at the NHL draft. And with that, everybody, I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. We sure enjoy bringing it to you. Take care.